The militants' signature attack in Afghanistan. And when does talk produce peace? Next on The Line. This is On the Line, and I'm Eric Felton. The top U.S. general in Afghanistan acknowledged that militants have made insider attacks their signature weapon in Afghanistan. NATO forces continue to be killed by their Afghan allies. General John Allen told CBS News, quote, "The enemy recognizes this is a vulnerability." Just this summer, U.S. officials were insisting that insider attacks were caused by personal grievances or disagreements and animosities among Afghan and NATO soldiers. Will insider attacks force a new strategy in Afghanistan? And what effect might new military leadership have on the Allied mission there? I'll ask my guest, Phil Stewart, Pentagon correspondent for the Reuters News Service. Welcome. Thanks for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me.
So it was really just a month or so ago when officials, both in the White House and the Pentagon, were insisting that personal grudges between individual soldiers were the causes of the attacks from Afghan soldiers, security forces, on their NATO allied forces. This seems to be a significant change now, the recognition that there's something else going on.
That's right. I think you've hit the nail on the head. What we have is a change in not just the recognition on the U.S. side and by NATO that there is an actual strategy being employed by the Taliban, but also a change in tactics in Afghanistan to try and address this new Taliban strategy.
Well, John Allen, the general in charge in Afghanistan, talked about how as the signature attack, it was sort of like in Iraq, where the signature attack of the militants there was the improvised explosive device, or IED. And that caused a real change in strategy. Is there change in strategy in Afghanistan similar in the way that they had to change strategy in Iraq to deal with the IED?
Well, at this point, Pentagon officials are denying that there's a change in strategy. What they're saying is we're changing tactics. But I've talked to analysts who believe that this change in tactics has strategic implications. So as we kind of raise our guard and protect ourselves against potential aggression by Afghan allies, there is a question whether or not NATO and the United States aren't putting a bit of distance between U.S. troops and Afghans, and whether or not that distance creates its own kind of dynamic is something we'll have to wait and see.
And in response to the IEDs in Iraq, there was something similar that happened where instead of having troops on foot in direct contact with people with a small footprint, you really had to move to these kind of big hulking vehicles that were armored to protect the troops, which made them not able to communicate and interact as directly with the people of Iraq.
Right. And what I think is also interesting here is that we have a situation where they're not quite sure. A lot of times the Afghans who are committing these murders, let's call them what they are, because it's not a combat situation. This is usually a case where someone just opens fire in an otherwise peaceful setting and kills forces in cold blood. So in the case of these murders, you have the Afghan aggressor is killed, and there's no way to find out, was he Taliban, was he this, was he that, without doing some pretty difficult digging. And that's something that NATO's probably trying to do right now, is find out, go to their villages, talk to the village elders, say, was this guy really in bed with the Taliban, or is this just some personal grudge? But this kind of investigation is something that needs to be done, and probably needs to be done very quickly, to find out the extent to which this Taliban campaign is a full-fledged campaign and where we're at.
And it does seem to have accounted for a rather large number of combat deaths of NATO troops, something like 1 in 5 combat deaths.
Yeah.
You've reported on efforts to reduce the number of joint patrols being done, and then perhaps that has been reversed a little bit just of late. Where is the Pentagon at this point on that?
We've been asking the Pentagon for details about how much have the Joint Patrols gone back to where they were before this order was introduced, and they are not able to say. They say the numbers are kind of iffy. We don't want to commit ourselves to anything, but most of them have gone back to normal. Well, we don't really know. I mean, they're certainly not back to where they were before.
Now, the Secretary General of NATO, in an interview with the Guardian newspaper, admitted that these insider attacks are taking a political toll on support for the NATO mission. He even recognized that that may be the very goal that the Taliban has in pursuing these attacks, but said that it may affect how willing NATO is to continue its involvement long-term in Afghanistan. What's your reading of how this is playing out in terms of the larger Allied effort?
Well, I think we have to look at the big picture here. We've got 27 months left on the clock for the war, right? It's supposed to end at 2014, when most combat troops are going to be out of that country. So the Taliban are looking at this and saying, we've lost a lot of ground. We've had a lot of setbacks, but how can we demoralize this mission as they're on their way out? And by all accounts, that 2014 deadline is not going to shift to the right. It's not going to become 2015 or 2016. It's going to stay where it is. And I think that this is a big strategy, and it seems to be successful. People in America or in these other countries are confused about why this is happening and why can't NATO get this under control.
And what's been the effect on NATO and U.S. troops? I mean, General John Allen, in his interview with CBS News, was saying that a willingness to take a lot of sacrifice for the mission in Afghanistan, but not a willingness to be murdered for it.
Right. I think that I did a big story about big in the sense of size. It was about 2,000 words on one insider killing that took place in August. And I spoke to one of the American victims' mothers, and she said that people in his unit were afraid. They were living in fear every day. I didn't get a chance to speak to people in his unit, but you can imagine that after what was otherwise a kind of a normal day, to have two of your colleagues in a small cop be mowed down it would have an effect on your morale, and it would make you wonder whether or not the other Afghans that you're around are trustworthy or not, and how they've been screened. So it has an effect at the level at the base level in Afghanistan, at the local level, and it has an effect back home where people are trying to reconcile that their son or daughter didn't die in combat; they died by the gun of an Afghan who we were trying to train.
Now, that training is the cornerstone of the strategy and the plan for exit from Afghanistan. The idea that the Afghan army and security forces will be trained and ready to go to take over security efforts for Afghanistan as the U.S. and other NATO allies leave the country. What do these insider attacks tell us about the readiness of the Afghan army, and do they suggest that there may be some full-blown infiltration of the Afghan security forces?
Well, I wouldn't go that far. I would say that we're looking at just over 50 deaths so far this year. That doesn't suggest a full-blown infiltration. They're going to get the Afghan security force numbers up to around 350,000. Just over that. And so I think that we're looking at still a limited problem that's meant to hit morale, and I think it's doing that.
What about morale within the Afghan army? Is there any sense of how this is affecting Afghan security forces?
I don't have the precise numbers, but I've been told that that the number of Afghan casualties by these insider attacks is also pretty high. I think that it's taking a toll on them. They don't know who. I mean, obviously, if they don't know who in their ranks might be Taliban, that would be a worry for them as well as they move towards 2014 and after 2014, when securing this country, which still has to deal with safe havens over the border with Pakistan, still has to deal with IEDs and a real resilient insurgency. They have to wonder. Do they have to worry about more than just the enemy on the other side of the hill?
There's some expectation that there'll be a new top commander in Afghanistan come the new year. Is there any expectation or talk that there is going to be any change in strategy in Afghanistan, or is there a notion that whatever the difficulties, the path is now set for an exit on a certain timetable?
Well, we're in Washington, and we're on the eve of a presidential election. And I think that at the moment, everybody's sort of waiting and seeing and kind of holding their breath until General Allen delivers his recommendations for the next couple of years. That will come after the election. So it'll be a post-presidential kind of recommendation on troop levels for the next 2 years. But you're right. I mean, he's leaving probably in January or at least early next year. And then we'll have a new commander there, another Marine, Joe Dunford, and you know, we'll see what he does. But I don't think that at this point there's going to be a change in the 2014 dateline. No one suggested that. And I don't see, I think the question is, you know, will the drawdown be gradual, or will it be fast? Will it be staggered? Are they going to try to hang on to all these 68,000 troops as long as they can? You know, and these are big questions that will probably be decided after the election.
Well, Phil Stewart is the Pentagon correspondent for the Reuters News Service. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks.
This is On the Line, and I'm Eric Felton. The United States Institute of Peace has led grassroots efforts at conflict resolution from Iraq to Colombia, Nigeria to Nepal. The Institute has gathered some of these case studies in peace building into a new book, Facilitating Dialogue. One of the authors of the book is Daniel Surwer, a professor of conflict management at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He joins us now to talk about what works and what doesn't in trying to talk peace. Welcome. Thanks for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
When people think about peace talks, they often think about diplomats in some fancy palace somewhere sitting on either side of a long table working out the particulars of a deal that ends a war. That's not the kind of peace building that you've been working on. How do you describe the kind of process that you've been working on?
Well, we've been working with civil society people, that is, people from voluntary associations, advocacy organizations, religious organizations, as well as some officials, sometimes local officials, sometimes national officials. But these haven't been formal peace talks. These are dialogue efforts that get people talking to each other and beginning to plan their future together again.
And why is that needed? Why is that important to get people together to talk about what they're going to do when a war is perhaps ended and it's time to just sort of get on with doing it?
Well, because people have stopped talking to each other during the war, or they're talking only to their good friends and not to their enemies. And they have to relearn the process of talking with each other in more civil ways. In addition, you've got some of these situations where there's not only a transition from war to peace, but from a socialist economy to a capitalist economy. This is unknown territory for people, and they need to begin to communicate with each other in ways that they haven't been able to in a dictatorial society in Iraq or in Kosovo, for example.
Now, this process, you generally have a facilitator, someone who's coming in to encourage the dialogue. Why do people need a facilitator? Why can't they get together themselves and have these conversations?
Well, if they do get together themselves and have these conversations, then there really is no need for a facilitator. But the fact is, these societies are broken and communications are cut off. And it often will require somebody from the outside, not necessarily of that society. We've used facilitators who were Iraqis, who were Colombians, who were local people. But it requires somebody from outside the active conflict to begin to reinitiate communications and relationships. It's not only communications conveys a kind of data communication. What's involved here are human relationships as well.
Well, tell us about some of these case studies that you've looked at. Is there anything that is consistent across the board, issues that are the same when you're dealing with them in Iraq as they might be in Nigeria or Colombia?
Well, there's one big thing, which is that it's always hard. It's never easy. after war, especially when people have been killing each other, there are issues. And those issues have to be surfaced and discussed, and that's not an easy process. Harm has to be acknowledged in order for people to begin to communicate with each other again. But in many other respects, dialogue is very specific to the particular context in which it occurs. So that, you know, interreligious dialogue in the Middle East can be quite distinct from interreligious dialogue in another part of the world. And it may not be that another part of the world needs interreligious dialogue. It may need interethnic dialogue. So context is really, really important, and understanding what the conflict was about, what the peace-building process needs to achieve is very important to the process.
Do you find that people are eager to get together and talk to the people that they've been at odds with, or does there need to be a lot of cajoling to get people to come together for this process in the first place?
In my experience, people are very wary of it. They're not sure they want to do it. They knew these people before, some of them, and they can't understand why violence has occurred. They resent it. And it can be quite some time before they have the self-confidence to meet with an enemy or meet with somebody from the old regime whom they regard as having done them harm. But I don't do any cajoling. I don't think it's right to kind of box people into talking to an enemy. I think what you have to do is break down what they want into some vital interests. And if they can begin to see that their vital interests require that they start talking to a former enemy, then they'll do it, and they'll do it happily. The other thing you've got to do is make sure it's not dangerous for them. Because, you know, when an Albanian after the war in Kosovo goes to talk with Serbs, that's dangerous.
And this is perhaps because there are people who don't want the dialogue going on.
There are people who don't want the dialogue. Sometimes we call them spoilers. And you have to be sure that a community is comfortable with itself before it goes out and meets with the other.
Is this peace building that happens at a local level, is this something that happens primarily after the big conflict is over and you're trying to heal the wounds, or does this kind of peace building, can it contribute to finding the larger peace itself?
Well, my experience has been mainly with post-big conflict dialogue, but I have seen instances in which it helps to get to the broader political agreement. The thing is, it's very difficult during a conflict to get kind of grassroots people together. That really is dangerous, and I don't personally have a lot of experience doing that. I'd like to see a lot more of it tried, though, but with the expectation that some things will fail. These are experiments. They are not tried and true methods that are going to produce results every time.
Is there anything in the case studies, perhaps from the work that was done in Iraq, where there is still interethnic, intersectarian violence going on, that can show the way for peace efforts in societies like Libya, where you still have a lot of violence in the aftermath of the dictatorial regime there?
Well, I think there is. I think the overall approach of facilitating dialogue to re-knit communities is transferable from one place to another. But the particular issues that you're going to deal with and the context in which you're dealing with them is very different in a place like Libya, where, you know, frankly, the Libyans left in Libya all agree that getting rid of Gaddafi was a good idea. That wasn't the case in Iraq, that everybody agreed it was a good idea to get rid of Saddam Hussein. So the local context always matters, and you have to be very careful not to transfer preconceptions from one conflict to another.
And when you have a society like Libya where you have tribal groups that are in different parts of the country. Are you able to do this kind of process where you bring people from different regions together as opposed to people who are sort of in close proximity to one another?
Well, you can, and I've seen it done. It can be quite difficult. I mean, in Libya in particular, you have some communities that have never had any contact with each other. And I'm not sure that's the highest priority, to be experimenting with new contexts. You've got other situations where people are living right nearby each other, where their livelihoods depend on a certain minimal amount of cooperation, and where there's enormous hostility. And that situation exists also in Libya. And those are situations I would give priority to.
And you talk about the effort to use sort of civil society groups as a way of building the structure for these talks. What about in countries where the civil society has been crushed for decades and where there really isn't much in the way of the informal associations that people have that can be the building block for conversation?
Well, what I find is that in the immediate aftermath of conflict, civil society blossoms in ways that people are very surprised at. The number of civil society organizations, media organizations, a place like Iraq or Libya is astounding when you consider how much these things were repressed once upon a time. But it's extraordinarily important to open the door to citizen participation in dialogue. If the politicians only meet with each other, whether it's at the local level or at the national level, they can jerk each other around day and night, and either they'll reach an agreement that if they've reached 10 times before and haven't implemented, or they'll never reach an agreement. Bringing citizens, especially citizens who represent something, into the picture gives you the possibility of holding the politicians' feet to the fire, and that's extraordinarily important.
I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. Daniel Surwer is a professor at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and co-author of the new book, Facilitating Dialogue, USIP's Work in Conflict Zones. Thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
Before we go, I'd like to invite you to send us your questions or comments. You can reach us through our website at voanews.com/ontheline. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you'll join us again next week for On the Line.
Going green at home, too much moolah for the hassle? You decide. Next on Smart Living. Recycle it and reuse it. It's a staple of green building, but it'll cost you. It's common for green builders to ask for 5 to 10% of building cost up front. Still, most upgrades are fully recouped within 2 to 5 years. But if you can't work on your home, you can make changes in your home.
It gives every consumer an option and the ability to do green things within their home.
For instance, a laptop computer uses 50% less energy to run per year than a desktop version. Also, a fridge with a top-loading freezer will save you 15% in energy cost over a year. Turns out side-by-side versions let more cool air escape. Finally, double-pane windows will save you a dime for every dollar as opposed to the single-pane brand. Just a couple of tips to help you conserve cash and stay eco-friendly in the new year. I'm Erica Washington reporting.
You all want to talk about this, and this is a genuinely great...